So, with that despairing note, the prospect of any stability, the only thing I was thinking as you made these presentations was that from a human rights perspective, the only thing we need is stability. And with the Houthis, ineffective control, you're saying from that presentation, they're in ineffective control, and meeting the Saudis blow for blow, there is no prospect for any ceasefire. The United Nations is not effective externally, and the international community is not effective externally in trying to bring a ceasefire to end the suffering of the people of Yemen.
I think at this stage in the conflict, like you said, Quentin, the United Nations is not a player. It certainly has tried to be a player, has been not given the opportunity by the powers that be, and obviously one of them would be the United States. There are no concrete movements to bring in the United Nations as either a mediator or even with boots on the ground to bring at least a ceasefire. You know, the United Nations have been calling for months for a ceasefire, at least to bring in some humanitarian aid into Yemen for the Yemeni population, and that has failed several times.
So aid agencies really can't get in there, and those that have been in there, Doctors Without Borders and many others, have suffered grievous injuries and death as a consequence of the no security for them, for their work. Do you want to have a go at that?
Well, I mean, even the blockade by the GCC prevented international aid from arriving in Yemen. So the international coalition that was attempting to provide aid were prevented from the international coalition to enter the country. So, you know, there has been an incredible amount of inconsistency around Yemen. I think, you know, at the moment, it's such a low-profile conflict in international consciousness that there's no real pressure on anyone, especially the Saudis, to open up channels for aid. And the United Nations isn't in a position to do it itself, given that it's stretched and it can't raise sufficient funds for all the humanitarian crises that it's dealing with. We've got Syria. It's involved in Syria. There are humanitarian crises in Africa. There's Burma with the Rohingya. I mean, it is overstretched at the moment, and the international aid donations are lower than they have been for decades. So these are all pressures that are playing into or deepening the crisis in Yemen as well. And
the United States, apart from the Al-Qaeda cells and the targeting of Islamic State, whenever there's any instability, that's when the Yanks move in to say, well, we've got to stop the vacuum that's created for a terrorist outfit to get control.
That's its only concern. Sorry, Quentin, that's its only concern, because what we've had in the last 2 or 3 decades with the US, I think since George W. Bush, is that when the Republicans in power, there's a pull away from the United Nations and the US's commitment to the UN and to international and its international commitments more generally. And then under the 8 years of Obama, we saw a re-engagement at that level. Trump, this is probably the lowest engagement of the US and the most cynicism we've seen around the UN by any US leader ever, and that's saying a lot given how George W. Bush and his representative John Bolton represented the UN. So the US has really, I think, abrogated its responsibilities in this regard altogether.
Tarek?
I completely agree. The United States at this stage, and like you said, Quentin, would only send troops if there is what's deemed to be a national security risk to the United States or its allies or its interests in the region. At the moment, Yemen does not qualify. What's happening now, as I understand it, is the United States is providing logistical power in terms of intelligence to the Saudis. Obviously, the weapons keep coming in. This conflict is being fought with Saudi money and U.S. weapons. But apart from that, the United Nations has not been given a chance to become a mediator in this, because the United States is not interested in that at this moment.
And I read that there are some 3 million refugees, Yemeni refugees.
That's right, and we're talking internally displaced. Yemenis, obviously, as in any conflict, would need to move to more secure areas. But as we're seeing day in, day out, there are probably no longer what we could call safe zones. Funeral processions are being targeted, hospitals are being targeted, schools are being targeted, and as the casualties mount, the pressure is going to increase on Saudi Arabia to do something about this, I think.
The brutality is unbelievable, but the Western media, which usually, at least its contribution would be to build up a consciousness from caring people all around the world, is some Al Jazeera. There's some we're seeing it every day. But it's not up to the same consciousness level as other humanitarian crises in the region.
Well, it's a little-known country that seems to be at the periphery of the Middle East. Strategically, it's only really important to, well, not only, but its main importance is to Saudi Arabia. And Al-Qaeda's efforts in Yemen, or its activities, are located within Yemen, yet it hasn't done an ISIS and taken its Yemeni struggle externally. So for many people, it really has little interest. I think also, given the events of the last 7 or 8 years in the Middle East, a lot of people are throwing up their arms and saying just another Middle Eastern conflict. If you think about Libya, Syria, Iraq, there is, I think, also a sense of pessimism about the region, and many of the sort of what we call it, sort of mainstream approaches to the Middle East now are this is just an area that's intrinsically conflictual. So this is what we should expect from this region. There is that element, I think, that's sort of started to embed itself, unfortunately.
I think from a media perspective, and this might sound stereotypical, but I'm talking from a media perspective. For a conflict to be covered by Western media, you need certain elements. You need to ask yourself a couple questions. Are there Western troops involved? Are there Western civilians involved? Are there Western interests at stake? Those three, they don't apply to Yemen. None of them do.
Well, there's fear of Iran.
Yes, but that's, again, I think on the periphery. It hasn't materialized to something, something that's really concrete. It's just fear of Iran is still across the board. It's not just in Yemen. It's in many other countries. It's in Bahrain. It's in Syria. So that conflict is continuing. But in Yemen's case, as long as you don't have Western military intervention, as long as you don't have Western civilians in the country, as long as you don't have direct Western interests, the oil is not being threatened. Oil supply is not being threatened. And you'll see that Western media will pick and choose when they will highlight Yemen in a news item. Noah mentioned earlier, the United Nations a week ago said Yemen is facing the worst humanitarian crisis. That made probably a couple of headlines and then faded again. We probably won't, unless there's a drastic event that happens within the next couple of weeks. I don't think we'll see Yemen in the headlines for a month or two.
Okay, any questions? Yes, John. Here's a mic coming. We're recording this.
Given what you mentioned about the US not seeing this as part of its strategic necessity at the moment, you still, in the background, have a meeting this weekend that's involved Erdogan in Turkey, Iran, and Russia. There are realignments taking place in the area. Most of these at the moment are focused on Syria. If Syria is sorted to some extent, does Yemen then become more strategically important as a chessboard for these interests to play out? And if that is the case, is there hope of some resolution in some of the way in which Syria was dealt with by external actors?
I think I can answer the first part of it, which is yes. I think if Syria is resolved in some shape or form, Yemen will become the major player, the major bargaining chip for Turkey, Russia, and Iran in that, as they face off against the United States and its allies, Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates. However, I don't, at this stage, unfortunately, I'm not optimistic as to the chances that Yemen will have to jump to the top of the queue in terms of a resolution of that conflict. Noah?
I'm sorry to disagree with you, but I think even if Syria was resolved, I think Yemen would still remain relatively unimportant, except to Saudi Arabia. I mean, Syria's real important. Syria has two reasons for Syria's importance. One, it borders Turkey, Iraq, and Israel. Secondly, because of that border, it also and the real threat, the strategic threat for the West, in particular around Syria, was that there was a fear of the so-called Shia corridor from Iran through Iraq into Syria, facing off against Israel. That, in effect, the Iranian border would run all the way to the Israeli border. That's not the case in Yemen. I think the one thing that could elevate Yemen to global prominence or international prominence is if some groups in Yemen decided to use it or could use it strategically to target international shipping, like Somalia in the 1990s. Given that it's a corridor of importance for shipping, it could potentially be elevated because of the risk to international trade. Other than that, I personally only see it as being strategically important to Saudi Arabia.
To follow up on that, the reason I said there is a chance that Yemen can possibly go to the top of the queue if Syria is resolved is because of that 1,800-kilometer porous border. If the Houthis do consolidate power, and if you see, as we're seeing now, Iranians in Syria, if you start seeing strategic Iranian elements in Yemen, and they infiltrate into Saudi Arabia, then I think at that stage, something's got to give. I think it will escalate to probably direct US intervention, because I don't think Saudi Arabia will stand aside and let that happen through its border.
Any other questions? Yes. Here's a mic.
How about the two-state solutions to go back like it was before? Is it a possibility? Like they will have a Houthi government and also a Saudi-backed separate government?
I think that's a possibility. I mean, we're seeing so many attempts across the Middle East to split up a number of countries. It's been flouted in Iraq as a federation. Yemen is another one of them. Whether that, but see, with that, if you do have a two-state solution, what do you do with the Houthis? And again, I'll have to go back to that border with Saudi Arabia. That will still constitute a major issue. I think if that solution does bear fruit, then there's gonna have to be major concessions on both sides.
It's an interesting question. I mean, there have been talks of a federal approach, power sharing. And power sharing has worked in a few other locations. It worked between the North and South Sudan until they separated in 1999. So there is a possibility there that the resolution to the conflict is, again, some form of separation. But that, again, I think from what I tried to show, that even if in separate entities, they were incredibly internally divided and fractious. So the solution for the Yemeni crisis, I think, requires a deeper political and economic project that sort of develops the infrastructure of the country and gives people a sense that there's some optimism and hope in being part of a social project called Yemen, whatever form it takes. And that hasn't been attempted in Yemen.
We've got time for one more. Yes.
Yes, just quickly, two questions. First one, I didn't get the background. What is the trigger for the civil war? I mean, before the war started, the government was pro-Saudi or the pro-Iranian, like? And the second question is I'm actually working in the oil industry, and you really have to look at the keeping the war going on. It's good for all this country producing oil, like for Iranian and the Saudis, because every time Saudi, there was a few news last week there was a missile launched from Yemen to Saudi airport, and on that particular day, oil went up like 5%. So, but I don't think but having said that, not necessarily means both sides want the conflict escalating, but they want the fighting going on, and then every time there's a small conflicts break out, and then can push the oil price go. Thank you.
I mean, Yemen's not a major oil producer. Certainly, if Saudi Arabia was affected by conflict or Iran, we'd see a huge spike in oil prices. I think the latest estimates are that Yemeni oil will run out in 2025. And that's, again, one of the great challenges this country faces, that, its major source of external revenue may dry up altogether in the space of a few years. So I think the oil dimension of it is probably less important than the geostrategic, in terms of where the Iranians and the Saudis see themselves, their responsibilities or their influence in this region. And I think from my perspective, to answer your first question, where did the conflict begin? Well, it really, I don't think it ever ended. How far back do you go to understand the conflict in Yemen? I think you do go back to the 1960s to get a sense of this country.
In a post-colonial sense.
In a post-colonial sense.
In that timeline,
Yeah, absolutely.
So if I can simplify it, the central government has almost always been pro-Saudi, and Iran has come into the picture to support the Houthis. And I guess that's how they pit Saudi Arabia against Iran.
Right. Look, we could go on for hours, but we've got to call this quits. Would you please thank Tarek and Noah? Just a little bit of proselytising we're going to go on with here. We've got the photographer handy. I'd like to call on Jane Anderson, Manager Multicultural Engagement, to present a small gift of appreciation to Noah Bassil on behalf of Affinity. Jane. Okay. Thank you. I'd like to call on... Oh, hang on, we've got to get our photo. De-escalating conflict. I'd like to call on Tanya Evans, Associate Professor from Macquarie University, to present a small gift of appreciation to Tarek Al-Issawi on behalf of Affinity.
Let me get out the photo.
Photo. Big smiles. Gorgeous. And now I'd like to call on Amit Polat, the Executive Director of Affinity, to present the closing remarks.